Welcome to Progress Toward Democracy. This is episode 2. It's May 2nd, 2016, and I deeply appreciate the feedback from many of you regarding the last video, the neoliberal assault, and there's a few points I wanted to refer back to on that, but also I wanted to remember a few people. A famous activist and poet passed away this weekend at the age of 95, Father Daniel Berrigan, and he was famous for his peace activism, and in particular in the year 1980 he basically broke into a General Electric facility that was basically a part of their defense contracting operations. And I remember seeing this facility, driving by the outside of it when I was a kid. My parents would sometimes drive up the Pennsylvania Turnpike outside of Philadelphia, and in the Valley Forge King of Prussia area outside of Philadelphia, there was a General Electric space facility. And my father told me that it was primarily for projects for NASA and probably research and developing technologies for the space program, as well as weather satellites and so forth. Actually, it turns out that wasn't the case. It was actually a facility for manufacturing components of weapons of mass destruction. For example, the cone heads that go on the top of nuclear missiles. And Father Daniel Brannigan in 1980 broke into the facility with several other activists who referred themselves as the Plowshare 8, and they damaged several warhead tops, obviously nothing explosive, and basically did a sit-in and were arrested for property damage. And it was a brave act to counter basically the attitude that we have for nuclear weapons. It wasn't only this past January that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which give doomsday warnings periodically regarding the possibility that we destroy ourselves in nuclear war, they moved their doomsday clock to 3 minutes to midnight, basically feeling that our continuous saber rattling with Russia was bringing us back to a Cold War era, and not the smart thing to do between two nations that are nuclear powered. And there's really two main threats that can wipe out our species, and nuclear war is one of them, and climate change is the other. And two very serious issues. Father Daniel Brannigan was an activist against one of them. Plowshares, of course, that comes from a biblical passage, I believe, I think I even wrote it down, which is Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4. They will beat their swords in the plowshares and their spears in the primary into pruning hooks. And nation will not take up sword against another nation, nor shall any nation train for war no more. But that's the type of world that we need going forward, really. And he shall be missed. Another activist who passed away recently that I've known, and many other local activists known her very well for years, Eileen Singer, who passed away in her early 70s, and she shall be missed as well. She was basically an activist and a local chapter leader for an organization co-founded by a Green Party presidential candidate, Dave Cobb, the organization called Move to Amend. I recommend going to their website in her honor, movetoamend.org, and signing the petition to amend the U.S. Constitution to remove corporate personhood rights. You could back up to me now. To remove corporate personhood rights and get the money out of politics. And campaign finance reform and getting the corruption and the rot out of our system was her was her primary area of activism. And basically, she was active up until the day she died. On the day she passed away, she was lobbying a local mayor, Mayor Skip Campbell of Coral Springs, to basically put in a local ordinance to keep the money out of the local politics there. Although, unfortunately, state law and federal law supersede such local ordinances, and the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision became the law of the land. Effectively, Move to Amend feels it's an important way to build the movement and to get these local, get the money out ordinances throughout nationwide, and they have several hundred established throughout the country so far. So it's a strong movement worthwhile looking into. I would also like to give special thanks to word I received from Hendrik Smith, who's one of the few journalists. There are many left-wing authors that have discussed what I've described regarding the neoliberal assault and how it caused, say, the loss of income flow to the middle class. But only one really good old-style investigative journalist put it together, who's not a left-wing academic, and that's Hendrik Smith. And he wrote the book, Who Stole the American Dream?, which I do recommend. Hendrik Smith is a frequent contributor to PBS Frontline news stories. So it's an amazing investigative journalist background, and he's nonpartisan, and he's pointing out the corruption as it stands. And he also recommended we all go to his website, reclaimtheamericandream.org, and I'll be talking about Hendrik Smith more in the future, I'm sure. But I would also like to address a few things pointed out to me, and not get too carried away with them. In the last time I was talking about basically how as wages for the middle class stagnated and stayed flat with respect to inflation, or if you were even lower in the income ladder went down, that played a role in putting stress on marriages and played a role in marriage and divorce rates going up considerably, up to now it's past 70%. I mean, the one fact that I know certainly is that when I was growing up, I mean, I was born around 1963, and at that time, there were more adults that were married than single. Now, in 2016, it's the reverse. More adults are single, and married couples are becoming a smaller proportion of our society. So, definitely a major social change. And I attributed some of this to the economics, and I would say a couple, how would I describe it, bourgeois feminists suggested otherwise. One pointing out to be that marriage is kind of an outdated thing in a way, because marriage is sort of something that denotes ownership of another person, the man owning the woman, which, you know, I mean, that's a notion of patriarchy in its most severe form, and I would agree with that. And if you go back, say, even a century and a half ago in this country, unfortunately, women's rights were still pretty bad, and a woman was still considered property of initially the father and then property of the husband afterward. So yes, there's truth to that, but as women's rights grew strong in this country from the 60s and 70s on upward, I think that couples entering those relationships see more as a partnership, and I don't think that's an attitude that exists now. But I get the point. There are a greater number of couples I wouldn't say couples, of people experimenting with different lifestyles. There's definitely a growth and a mainstreaming of what's called polyamorous relationships. In other words, where rather than monogamous relationships, people that believe that you can't really be committed to a single person but multiple people. I do know people that are polyamorous activists. I personally have a neutral position on it. I mean, my relationships in my life have always been monogamous. But I mean, I understand their point is that perhaps there's a consciousness awakening among people, and as a result, people are looking and experimenting with different types of relationships, and rather than monogamous, polyamorous, and thus that's just causing marriage to dissolve away. I don't think that's as significant as people would suggest. Some people talking to me about that issue have pointed out that there are some studies that suggest that people are happier in that way in some sense, with evolutionary psychological reasonings going back to when earlier man was more polygamous, which is not the same as polyamorous. That's a man of power having multiple women under him, which is, you know, rather different. However, I've also seen scientific studies that suggested that such relationships have an incredibly high failure rate. So I've seen there's literature on both sides. You know, social science related studies are not physics. You know, we're not hardcore predictable and so forth. So my guess is that while polyamorous lifestyle for some may be mainstream and acceptable, and that's an additional choice to monogamous life, I don't think that goes against my point of economics changing so that in the past it was possible for one man to make the money and provide for everybody, versus a future where both have to work and they're still not making the bills, they're still barely making the bill. So that creates a stress which causes marriages to failure. I don't think that point is hurt. I would say there's other evidence that the capitalism, the neoliberal capitalism, dramatically impacts intimate relationships and so forth. I mean, for example, and this is kind of interesting, because we have students graduating from college with significantly heavy layers of debt, $20,000 to $50,000 to, in some cases, $100,000 plus. It's affecting the nature of relationships. There's a less of a desire to get married and basically try to have a family and raise a kid because you have to worry about this debt. Matter of fact, there's a growing trend of these kids not even seeking home ownership because they have this added debt, and 50% of the students still have trouble getting jobs that are newly graduated. That there's evidence that a lot of them don't even want to own cars, and they're using Uber more often. You know, but one class of them are actually going online seeking sugar daddies. You have a growing trend of sugar babies. This is actually being studied. You know, take a look. Here's an article that was published fairly recently, April 5th, 2016. More California students turn to sugar daddy dating sites as tuitions rises. Published in newuniversity.org through a website seeking arrangements. Basically, they point out that on average, sugar babies annually receive $20,920 or more in allowance money from an older man. So basically, they're getting this sugar daddy. It's an older man who wants a relationship with a younger girl and will take the burden of her debt. And let's see, of this allowance of 20,920, which is the average, sugar babies spend an average of 36% on tuition, 23% on rent, 20% on books. Actually, if you search out, there are several articles and several publications describing this phenomenon nationwide, and this new type of effect from neoliberal capitalism is even spreading to England, of all places. So here's an article about because tuition has gone up, England doesn't have cheap college anymore, and so the rise of the sugar baby students who sell themselves to older men to fund their studies isn't a so basically, if that isn't the economics, the capitalism impacting the nature of our relationships, I don't know what is. I mean, that's the best example you can get, right? So definitely the nature of our capitalism and the economics around us significantly impacts our relationships. And what I would call bourgeois feminists tend to, I think, neglect that or forget that or see things through a privileged point of view. And that's always been true of the feminist movement to a point. For example, there is an anti-feminist commentator who's much loved by the conservative movement, who's quite up in age now, a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, who was basically known for chronically saying rather ugly things. You may remember within the past year or so, President Obama was talking about, he actually ran a campaign pushing back against rape in college, which is a problem. And so it's an issue that the White House was doing some advocacy about it. Phyllis Schlafly's comment about women getting raped in college was on the order of, well, if a woman decides to choose a life of not becoming a housewife but go to college, that's what she should expect that. Obviously, that's ugly, but that's Phyllis Schlafly. How did she become a powerful commentator that's sought on Fox News, and her political endorsements are sought by people on the right, the conservatives and so forth? Well, if you go back to the 70s, the feminists had a tendency to be critical of women that preferred to be housewives, and in particular blue-collar housewives. So they were criticizing, you had women of an upper middle class, petite bourgeoisie, criticizing working blue-collar women. And they defended their position and pushed back hard, very hard, because at that time there was also a movement to amend the Constitution to make sure that there would be equal rights for all genders, the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. And this movement among blue-collar women, and spearheaded by people like Phyllis Schlafly, and that's how Phyllis Schlafly rose in power, pushed back so hard that the Equal Rights Amendment was pretty much killed in its tracks. And people to this day are still trying to get that amendment on the Constitution, and it probably will never happen. But actions through the courts pretty much made up for the rights that were being sought in the ERA. So anyway, going back to the original point, yes, it's hard to quantify these things. Interestingly enough, I did come across one article that talked about a survey of couples that go through divorce, and really only 22% of them say money issues directly, but the majority of them, 42%, 44% say incompatible. They're divorcing out of compatibility, but that's a very generic term. Money could have, and stress induced from lack of it could have played a role in that. May not in some cases, but could have played in many. And also when asked, I think there's a good chance that people would think lesser of themselves if they said money was the problem and so incompatible. Another 20% or so divorced because of infidelity, cheating on each other. Much smaller percentages, less than 5% and so forth, to abusive situations. Thank heavens, but even that figure is probably still too high. I would also like to dedicate this video and all future videos to the woman that inspired me to do so, who's no longer with us, my former love and girlfriend, Gloria Gilmore, who died October 31st, 2014 from pancreatic cancer. And I to this day I miss her a lot. But she was critical of the system, became a lot more so as she got to know me, of course. But she literally was making anti-capitalist rants on her deathbed, and a few weeks before she passed away, in which she was telling me to do something about it. She always wanted me to speak in a bigger forum, and I miss her. I would like to show a picture of her to you guys, assuming I didn't misplace the photos, because since we started filming, I've been moving stuff back and forth. Could you stop for a second? And this is a picture of Gloria and me, and she passed away 2014 at the age of 69. And I'll show you one more picture or two. If I could, there we go. And so, dedicate to her. And she was a very positive influence on me. Okay, I'll put your facing me for good luck. And would like to talk about Alan Greenspan. And it's sort of as a continuation of my last talk. Recall neoliberal assault. I referred to when the nature of our economics changed so that massive inequality began. All the wealth started going to the top 1%, and labor share of income was taken away by several major factors. I got this from an article written by Bruce Bartlett, who's an economist that worked in the Reagan administration. He's not hardly a lefty by any stretch of the imagination. And that was published June 11, 2013. And I can't recall the name of it. But the data in the article, what the falling labor share of income, what components took away the income, was published in a study that he referenced, the International Labor Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations. It was part of their global wage report for 2012-2013 time period, and they found 46% of labor's share of income was taken away by financialization. That 19% was taken away by globalization. So globalization is basically the offshoring of jobs. So that's us competing with cheap labor in, say, Bangladesh or China. Technological change is 10%, that's automation. So, for example, the replacement of middle management by local area networks. Robotization over the past 10 years has been there and kind of low. It's accelerating greatly now and is expected to accelerate even faster into the future. So we will see a lot more jobs lost to automation going forward. And 25% due to what is called, what are referred to as institutional factors, meaning primarily the death of labor unions. In other words, labor unions getting weak. At one point, labor unions were a third of the public sector, the private sector, and now it's down to about 6.5% of the private sector is unionized. So all these played a role in basically people's wages going flat. And around 1981-82, that took effect. Actually, some of the policies that caused that were put in place by the president earlier than Reagan. Jimmy Carter started it. Jimmy Carter, basically under him, we began deregulation of the trucking industry, airline industry, and the breakup of Big Ma Bell, AT&T. But each one of those cases also adversely impacted the unions in those industries by a significant amount. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, around the time of Carter, you had truck drivers that made six figures. They might have been driving all hours of the night and rarely had much of a family life. But they made a significant amount of change. And those days came to an end after trucking deregulation. So we had the beginning effects under Carter. He began deregulation of the savings and loan sector. That carried off into a savings and loans crisis under Reagan. But I mean, there was the early beginnings of neoliberalism then. Even though Carter today comes across as an extremely liberal left-wing president, still around, gives talks and so forth. For that time, he was fairly right-wing, and you actually had a progressive, which we should say, New Deal era Democrat challenge him at the time. On the primary side, his primary challenger was Ted Kennedy. And that probably hurt his re-election chances more so than the Iranian hostage crisis at the time. But Carter only lasted one term and was replaced by Ronald Reagan, who was further to the right and basically continued on the neoliberal policies. Clinton did even, well, the biggest neoliberal policy push that I would say Reagan put through was the massive tax cuts to the wealthy from 70% all the way down to 28%. Clinton then continued with a harsh crime bill, with repealing Glass-Steagall, which is the Chinese wall between commercial and investment banking and welfare reform, as well as basically refusing to enforce labor laws. So that continued on to the next president. We had a Bush and so forth. So it's been pretty uniform. It's not truly a partisan issue. Alan Greenspan, our 13th Federal Reserve Chairman, basically, and I think we should hear him talk. Alan Greenspan was primarily a free market ideologue. He followed the teachings of Milton Friedman, who was a very influential economist on public policy. And he had known personally, and it's been suggested even had intimate relationships with early on, before he was chairman, with Ayn Rand, who pushed a philosophy known as objectivism, which involved a strong belief in laissez-faire capitalism, capitalism with no government regulation and so forth, and a very bizarre free market ideology. Alan Greenspan was our chair. Was a basically long time. He was a chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1987 all the way up to 2006. So almost 19 years. And initially he was for privatizing. Actually, he was always for privatizing Social Security. And he had some fairly harsh views on a number of issues, actually. It's believed that a number of times he saved us from horrible recessive cycles becoming worse. Excuse me, my mouth is a little dry. But it's also believed that he is one of the key figures primarily responsible for the financial crisis that led to the Great Recession in 2008, and that's because he had such an easy money policy to the banks. He kept interest rates down to the level where basically it cost the Federal Reserve member banks nothing at all to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, and for them to lend it to homeowners was easy profit for them, and encouraged bad behavior in terms of making reckless liar loans to the public, and it fed into what became the housing bubble, which burst into a horrible crisis. It's regarding his influence in policy that I want to bring up, and would like to show you a video regarding that. In particular, one aspect, globalization. Let's take a look at Alan Greenspan giving a talk. I think this talk was given around 2007 or so. It was before 2006. It was before the crisis. He published a book called The Age of Turbulence, and he's being asked about it. And he starts off stating that in his view, the future, we have to worry a bit, because we're going to come to a point where we have to worry about how natural resources are distributed to people. We're going to face a scarcity of natural resources. I have to point out that I have an issue with that, because we're 5% of the world's population, but we consume 33% of the world's resources. So perhaps if we change the nature of our capitalism, we can change the nature of our consumption, right? There's no reason why we couldn't consume less. For example, our industry is a big believer in planned obsolescence. In other words, things wear out, so then you have to replace and buy. And if you go back into the past, there was a day and age where we would have repair shops around and repair, you know, they would repair the radios and the TVs and the toasters and so forth. We don't repair anything anymore. Planned obsolescence. Throw it away, buy something new from scratch. Keep the cash flow going into the system. It's incredibly profitable, but it's incredibly wasteful. That's one of many. Vegans talk about how basically beef production is incredibly wasteful in terms of the amount of water used and the amount of vegetation grown to feed beef, and so forth. So my only point is that we can change our consumption patterns so we can still live a comfortable life without us facing a crisis. This doesn't enter his mind. So let's start from there.
We don't have enough resources to meet everybody's needs. That's going to be a terrible situation.
And that's part of in that Delphic Future chapter, and you deal with that. The other question you deal with is your concern about growing income inequality in the United States, and how to address it.
This book is basically a extraordinary analysis as far as what our history has been. It's pan to capitalism, market capitalism, and what it has done since Adam Smith and David Hume and John Locke visualized relationships in society which had never existed before, and which created a huge increase in per capita income, that is the creation of a capitalist society, huge increase in population, because now you could sustain it, and a very dramatic rise in life expectancy, as well as all sorts of other considerable advantages. But it is in the nature of capitalism, and it's a theme running through the book, that it never seems to get acceptance by the vast majority of people. And the reason is that one of the key aspects of capitalism is competition, which is a very difficult thing when you are competed out of business. In other words, it's what I call in here, Schumpeter came up with Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Harvard Austrian economist, came up with a fascinating discussion of capitalism called creative destruction.
Okay, would like to make one point. Basically, Alan Greenspan is pointing out for a good majority of the population that works for a living, not those in the capitalist class, the capitalism kind of sucks. So as I thought that was interesting. So as a person that sort of is extremely free market capitalist, that's as pro-capitalist as you can get, is saying, well, there is an issue. Most of the public really doesn't enjoy it, even though we're convinced that we're very pro-capitalist society. We're told how much to love capitalism. And oh dear. And basically didn't realize I had the microphone off. And basically, let's just continue on. I think my basic point was, I just thought that was for someone that's supposed to be a key figure in managing our capitalism and being a staunch cheerleader for it, he recognizes that it's very tough on the average person because we're forcing people to compete not with just each other but with people offshore.
In which you move the least productive facilities, the obsolescent facilities, to the most productive cutting-edge facilities, and with it creating higher income per capita. But you are essentially forgetting that there are a lot of people on the destructive side who are losing their jobs, have all sorts of problems.
And I think you're saying that inequality is increasing in the United States.
Yes, inequality is increasing. The data are just very clear. Part of it is the result strictly of the rapid increase in technology. But the reason I say it's crucially important is that you cannot have the benefits of capitalist market growth without the support of a significant proportion, and indeed virtually all of the people. And if you have an increasing sense that the rewards of capitalism are being distributed unjustly, the system will not stand.
So in shorthand, what's your recipe for addressing it?
Well, my shorthand is essentially one, to recognize that a goodly part of the problem is the decline in primary and the decline in our primary secondary education system, which I go into in some detail. And there are studies which show that our fourth grade students average in math and science worldwide. By the time they get to the end of high school, they're way at the bottom.
So it's education.
It's education, and really the most controversial thing I've got in the book is to augment immigration of skilled labor. We pay the highest skilled labor wages in the world. If we would open up our borders to skilled labor far more than we do, we would attract a very substantial quantity of skilled labor, which would suppress the wage levels of the skilled, because we skilled are being essentially subsidized by government, meaning our competition is being kept outside the country. But if we bring in a number of workers to suppress the level of wages relative to the lesser skilled, we will reduce the degree of inequality. And it's, as I point out in the book, for reasons which is really fascinating.
Okay, so basically, that's kind of interesting. Greenspan points out there's great economic inequality, which he blames partly on the educational system. Well, we know that's not true. But also that essentially economic inequality he also blames on technology. And as we see, technology is a component, but not the biggest one. He wants to deal with economic inequality. What does he recommend? He says, well, we have these people that have become middle class, upper middle class professionals, engineers, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. Let's bring them down in pay to those that already are also seeing their standard of living going downhill because of prior trade agreements. That'll do it. So we can bring part of the top down, and that'll lessen inequality. Of course, he doesn't say anything about the rich that are taking all the wealth. They still are on top, and probably after that thought and scheme, probably get even more wealth and go higher. What is he talking about? Basically, he's talking about H-1B visas. H-1B visas allow guest workers from other countries to basically work here. Nothing wrong with that. However, if it's trying to bring people's wages down deliberately, well, unfortunately, people aren't really thrilled by having their standard of living deliberately lowered. And so it's a notion that continues to push these neoliberal ideas. He's talking about it as an idea, but it's been put in practice. Indeed, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act, had a cap of 65,000 H-1B workers, which Congress cannot go lower. Congress cannot circumvent NAFTA. That's what that one trade agreement did. And other trade agreements apparently did something similar. The upcoming Trans-Pacific Partnership apparently enhances this effect and allows, say, an engineer from India to come in, and he won't be paid as much as, say, the American worker. And since that Indian engineer is perhaps a guest worker for a year or two, the corporation doesn't have to worry about benefits such as retirement plan and so forth. So lower costs, displacing American worker. And that's an issue, definitely. And it's a continuation of the globalization effects started with NAFTA and so forth. So that's Greenspan's solution going forward. He actually testified to a congressional committee. It was a subcommittee in the Senate, August 30th, 2009, in which he stated that the H-1B visa is far too small to meet the need of Wall Street. Well, Wall Street financialization is basically in charge because they want to see publicly traded company profits go up. And so what makes profits go up keeps finance sector heavy, because financialization is the finance sector dominates. Let's continue listening to Alan Greenspan.
On some certain studies that have been taken, they're now generally accepted, that the level of real income of people is not what determines whether they are happy or not. It's their pecking order in the society. It may be a discouraging view of human nature, but that's what we are, whether we like it or not. It really matters to us where we are. You know, if real material well-being were the determinant of happiness, you couldn't get this huge increase in per capita income without any evident increase in happiness of the people involved. And therefore, the issue of income inequality is a very difficult and very important issue that must be addressed in this country.
Let me before coming to a couple of last questions, just flag something that I think might surprise the audience. But towards the end of the book...
Well, that's pretty much the end of that segment. But basically, well, it's okay if we lower the standard of living of, say, the professional class. It's their pecking order, as he puts it, their status that's important, not their material standard. And there are studies that indicate that. And yes, I would say there's truth to that. There's definitely truth to that. Unfortunately, it's not. Doesn't make a positive talking point. I mean, for example, let's go back to the early history of this country. We had a day and age where we had both white and black people enslaved. We had African slaves, and we had what were called indentured servants from Ireland and so forth. And so if you say 1663, for example, there was an interesting year regarding plantations in Gloucester County, primarily tobacco plantations, Gloucester County in the state of Virginia. where you had both black slaves and white slaves, indentured servants, working together, and the labor was horribly oppressed. They were basically treated very poorly, and they revolted against the rich. It was a class revolt with black people and white people working side by side, going against the rich. And oddly enough, they even had Native Americans that were planning to work with him, but it didn't get very far. It was unveiled as a conspiracy, and several people were beheaded as a result, and it was stopped. But there were a number of early rebellions and slave revolts like that. And so what was done in early American history is the poor white population, basically they were given limited property rights, indentured servitude was gotten rid of, and basically the poor white people were told, you'll be looking over the slaves. I mean, they were given a higher pecking order, let's say. So they might have even seen somewhat of an increase in standard of living. Let me show you a little. Well, I had a little graphic, but I don't have it now. I guess I took it down. But basically, that was basically divide and conquer of the wealthy elites on a substantial portion of the population, because the poor whites were kept poor. They weren't going to get jobs from the plantation owners because those plantation owners had their needs fulfilled by the slaves. So really, they were exploited by the wealthy too, and exploited all the way up until and including Civil War era, in which poor whites were snookered into fighting for the Confederate rich. Actually, it was poor on both sides doing most of the fighting. The Civil War, a horrible war that killed 620,000 Americans, more Americans than any armed conflict that America was ever involved in afterward, more than World War II, and so on and so on. I think trying to apply a pecking order to populations that are experiencing a declining standard of living probably will be a little harder, and let's hope we don't get snookered, and we don't have the elites basically tell us what to do. But that's Alan Greenspan's point of view. That's his vision for the world. It's a vision that's built in to get and expected to get worse in the future. It wasn't just a nice idea on Alan Greenspan's part. It is getting translated into policy. Here's an article on Obama's trade win brings H-1B unease. Articles I'm pointing out, I'll put them as references at the bottom of the YouTube video. This was written by Patrick Thibodeau in Computer World on June 25th, 2015. I mean, so not only are blue-collar working-class jobs going to be threatened, but we'll see a loss of control by Congress for H-1B visa issuance, and declining of standard of living for, say, people that are used to getting higher pay in information technology-oriented jobs. So again, it's more of a falling away of the middle class, and it's sort of already built in. Going back to Alan Greenspan, I would like to. I am a supporter of Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders actually brings up information technology workers losing their job to people in India when he questions Alan Greenspan around, I think, 2003, 2004. But it's worthwhile watching.
Thank you. Mr. Sanders?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Greenspan, nice to see you again. Mr. Greenspan, I have long been concerned that you are way out of touch with the needs of the middle class and working families of our country, that you see your major function in your position as the need to represent the wealthy and large corporations. And I must tell you that your testimony today only confirms all of my suspicions, and I urge you, and I mean this seriously, because you're an honest person. I think you just don't know what's going on in the real world. And I would urge you, come with me to Vermont, meet real people. The country clubs and the cocktail parties are not real America. The millionaires and billionaires are the exception to the rule. You talk about an improving economy while we have lost 3 million private sector jobs in the last 2 years. Long-term unemployment has more than tripled. Unemployment is higher than it has been since 1994. We have a $4 trillion national debt. 1.4 million Americans have lost their health insurance. Millions of seniors can't afford prescription drugs. Middle-class families can't send their kids to college because they don't have the money to do that. Bankruptcy cases have increased by a record-breaking 23%. Business investment is at its lowest level in more than 50 years. CEOs make more than 500 times of what their workers make. The middle class is shrinking. We have the greatest gap between the rich and the poor of any industrialized nation, and this is an economy that is improving. I hate to see what would happen if our economy was sinking. Now, today you may not have known this. I suspect that you don't, but you have insulted tens of millions of American workers. You have defended over the years, among other things, the abolition of the minimum wage, one of your policies, and giving huge tax breaks to billionaires. But today you reached a new low, I think, by suggesting that manufacturing in America doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where the product is produced. We lost 2 million manufacturing jobs in the last 2 years alone, 10% of our workforce. Walmart has replaced General Motors as the major employer in America, paying people starvation wages rather than living wages, and all of that does not matter to you. Doesn't matter. If it's produced in China where workers are making 30 cents an hour, or produced in Vermont where workers can make 20 bucks an hour, it doesn't matter. You have told the American people that you support a trade policy which is selling them out, only working for the CEOs who can take our plants to China, Mexico, and India. You insulted Mr. Castle. Mr. Castle, a few moments ago, a good Republican, told you that we're seeing not only the decline of manufacturing jobs, but white-collar information technology jobs. Forrester Research says that over the next 15 years, 3.3 million U.S. service industry jobs and 136 billion in wages will move offshore to India, Russia, China, and the Philippines. Does any of this matter to you? Do you give one whit of concern to the middle class and working families of this country? That's my question.
Congressman, we have the highest standard of living in the world.
No, we do not. You go to Scandinavia and you will find that people have a much higher standard of living in terms of education, healthcare, and decent paying jobs. Wrong, Mr. Greenspan.
May I answer your question?
You sure may.
Thank you. For a major industrial country, we have created the most advanced technologies, the highest standard of living for a country of our size. Our economic growth is crucial to us. The incomes, the purchasing power of our employees, our workers, our people are by far more important than what it is we produce. I submit to you that, may I?
Well, I mean, let's set aside the rest of the video because it's kind of going off in a different direction. Wow. If the incomes which give us the purchasing power are so relevant to the growth of the economy, then aggregate demand from us consumers wouldn't be continuing to be on a downward slide. I mean, primarily the crisis of capitalism is due to the contradiction that corporations want to increase their profit, and one way to increase profit is to cut labor costs, but then you have the contradiction that you're also killing the customer because labor also are consumers. And that leads to crisis of overproduction, where too many products get made in times where consumers can no longer buy, such as the financial crisis that led to so many layoffs. And the crises are getting worse and worse, and will continue to do so. The crisis would have destroyed the capitalism a long time ago, but the capitalism has to seek external growth via other means, sometimes by extraction of wealth, but by intruding in the capitalism of other societies, or the economics of other societies, via imperialism. And that's how that starts. But as we see under neoliberal capitalism, as individuals, people become human capital. Basically, we're expected to enhance our value, and as we enhance our value, ideally we enhance personal income streams to us, and that increases our value in society. That's why the poor are much hated in our society, and the homeless are really hated in our society because they are seen as providing no value to society. Those are topics we will explore going forward. But thanks for viewing me, and I look forward to talking to all of you again soon.